How are we saved? It's a simple question, but the human tendency is to begin to think it's based on what we do. Most religions emphasize our actions, saying we need to climb the mountain to God or the divine being. Christianity says another has climbed this mountain on your behalf. While Romans and Galatians are written to two different communities, it is beneficial to look at them together, for they both describe how people are made right with God by faith in Jesus' work, not by our works. Galatians might be the first book that Paul wrote to the communities he visited in his first missionary journey in modern-day Turkey. You can read about that in Acts 13 through 14. In Galatians, Paul argues nothing can be added to the gospel of the crucified Messiah. Some were claiming circumcision and Torah observance were necessary for Gentile believers to become members of God's covenant people. Paul argues these people preach a different gospel. If you add anything to Jesus' work, you take away from it. Both Jews and Gentiles are free in Christ. They live by the Spirit, not by the flesh, not by their ethnicity, not by their works. Paul essentially tells a series of stories to support his point. Stories about himself, stories about Christ, stories about the Galatians, and about salvation history. He begins, as you can see on the chart, by defending his own authority to validate his message in chapters 1 and 2. Then he gives arguments for justification by faith, both from experience and from biblical history in chapters 3 through 4. And finally, he argues they have freedom in Christ by the Spirit in chapters 5 through 6. Romans, on the other hand, is Paul's longest letter and maybe his most famous one. When Paul writes Romans, he hasn't even visited the city yet. He writes to them to explain the gospel that he preaches, to also unify Jews and Gentiles in that city under the Jewish Messiah, and to gain support for his mission trip to Spain. At the heart of Romans is the theme, the righteousness of God. Paul asserts that God's goodness, his justice, his faithfulness is revealed in the gospel. It is by trust in the Messiah and not by works of the law that all people are made right with God. Therefore, Paul's gospel is both for Jews and for Gentiles. Romans begins with Paul's thesis. The gospel is God's power for all people because in it, the righteousness of God is revealed, and the righteous will live by faith. The rest of the letter expands upon the revelation of righteousness. As you can see on your chart, first Paul shows God's wrath is revealed against all unrighteousness of Jews and Gentiles. Humanity has denied God's righteousness. Then Paul explains how righteousness is declared through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This results in hope and life in the Spirit in chapters 5 through 8, because Jesus has conquered where Adam fell. But how can God be righteous if so many in Israel have not responded? Paul defends God's righteousness in Romans 9 through 11, arguing Israel was disobedient, but God was faithful to his promises. Finally, Paul turns to righteousness displayed in Romans 12 through 15, urging Roman believers to offer their bodies as living sacrifices. I hope you will join me as we look at the core of Paul's gospel found in Galatians and Romans.